Imagine, like, waiting a full year for a life-changing medical appointment.
Oh, wow. A whole year.
Right, a full year, only to call and cancel it the week before out of sheer terror of ending up on a government watch list.
I mean, that is just a heartbreaking reality.
It really is. But that is the actual reality behind the pastel-colored hashtags of Autism Acceptance Month. Because you see the corporate logos change colors every April.
Oh, absolutely.
The social media campaigns just flooding your feed, painting this picture of a society that has, like, finally embraced neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's a very pretty picture.
But today, our mission is to look at a profound piece of writing by autistic clinical social worker Jennifer Cork. And this was published in Psychology Today. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What does all this quote-unquote acceptance actually mean if the people we claim to be accepting are fundamentally unsupported by the very infrastructure of our society?
Right, because, I mean, it is a massive disconnect between public performance and private reality. We are essentially throwing a welcome party for a demographic that is quietly drowning in systemic neglect.
That is exactly it. So whether you are a healthcare professional trying to catch up on the latest neurodivergent research, or maybe someone advocating for a loved one, or even if you are just an insanely curious learner who wants to understand the actual architecture of this systemic failure, this deep dive is going to cut straight through the performative noise.
It's definitely needed.
Okay, let's unpack this. The explicit goal here is to examine the harsh realities faced by autistic individuals when acceptance is treated as just like a trendy buzzword, totally divorced from any tangible action.
Yeah, and to understand the friction we're seeing today, we really have to look at the timeline.
Right, the history of it.
Exactly. The historical context is crucial because the terminology itself is, well, it's kind of a map of the movement's evolving goals. If you go back to 1970, right in the thick of the broader disability rights movement, this began as autism awareness.
Just awareness.
Right. And it eventually gained enough traction to receive a presidential proclamation in 1988. But for decades, the sole objective was simply to make the public aware that autism existed.
Which, to be fair, makes sense for the 1970s and 80s.
Oh, for sure.
But eventually, society hits a saturation point with awareness.
What's fascinating here is the psychological difference between awareness and acceptance. Because, awareness is entirely passive.
Yeah, doesn't ask much of you.
Exactly. It is simply the cognitive recognition that a demographic exists. By 2011, advocates realized that society had largely achieved that baseline. People knew the word autism.
Right.
But knowing something exists doesn't require you to alter your behavior or restructure your society to actually accommodate it. So in 2011, led by organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, there was a successful push to rebrand the month to Autism Acceptance.
And this wasn't just a PR move, right?
Yeah.
Like, this was a fundamental shift away from the older deficit-based medical models.
Yep.
Because the historical approach heavily focused on curing autistic people, basically viewing them as broken versions of neurotypical individuals.
Which is incredibly damaging.
So damaging.
Yeah.
But the new paradigm emphasizes belonging. In 2021, ASAN released a statement that really serves as the thesis for this entire discussion. They said, acceptance is an action.
And that phrase places the burden of adaptation exactly where it belongs onto society.
Yes.
It shifts the dynamic from demanding the autistic individual change their neurology to fit the world to demanding the world adjust its environment to foster true belonging.
I think about it like this, awareness is like acknowledging there is a door. You see the door, you know it's there. But acceptance is actually opening that door, inviting someone inside and making sure they have a place to sit.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks. But looking at the clinical data and the lived experiences detailed in the research, I really have to challenge this idea of where we currently are. Because we might be inviting people into the room now, sure, but is a seat at the table really enough if the chair is broken? Like if it just collapses the second you sit down?
Man, that is the exact reality we have to confront. Because if we look at the actual infrastructure, the metaphorical chairs at this table, they're completely broken.
Completely.
Without adequate, tangible support, this cultural acceptance is basically an illusion, and the consequences of that illusion are playing out in the homes of families and individuals every single day.
So let's look at the mechanisms of that failure, starting with caregiver burnout, because the examples detailed in the text are they're visceral.
They really are.
There's a story of a couple getting ready for their first date night in 6 months, and they have to cancel their reservations because the one trusted sitter who is equipped to care for their autistic child, falls ill.
Just one person they can rely on.
Right. Or the mother, who is rocking her screaming child at 2 a.m., just absolutely desperate for someone to take over for just one night so she can sleep.
And, it is easy to hear those stories and categorize them as just, well, typical parenting struggles.
Yeah, people do that a lot.
But that completely misses the mechanism at play. What we are looking at is a socioeconomic void in modern healthcare. Because respite care for high-needs autistic children isn't just babysitting.
No, not at all.
It requires specialized behavioral and medical training. So when a society fails to fund and provide that specialized care, the family unit is just forced to become a 24/7, totally unsupported medical facility.
And the bottleneck for specialized care, it extends to vital therapies too. The piece mentions a mother trying to find an occupational therapist for her 5-year-old child who has ARFED, that's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder.
Yeah, and we should clarify what ARFED actually is because the
Yeah.
mechanism is widely misunderstood by the public.
Oh, definitely.
It is not picky eating. It is a severe neurological and sensory barrier to food, where the brain interprets certain textures or tastes or smells as a literal threat.
A literal threat. Wow.
Yeah, leading to physical gagging or severe distress. It requires highly specialized occupational therapy to rewire that sensory response.
But get this, the only local OT who specializes in this has a 2-year wait list.
2 years.
2 years for a 5-year-old. The mother's only alternative is to drive over an hour each way for services, which would obviously jeopardize her employment.
Of course.
So she's just forced to abandon the therapy entirely. That is a systemic trap.
It really is. And honestly, the roadblocks within the medical system itself are arguably even more dangerous. The source material details a depressed teenager who is explicitly denied mental health care by a facility, specifically because he has an autism diagnosis.
Wait, denied because of the diagnosis?
Yes. The psychiatric system often silos autism, classifying it as a quote-unquote behavioral issue rather than treating the co-occurring mental health condition. And the only provider in his area with the relevant intersectional training has a wait list extending over a year.
Which just forces patients into a crisis.
Yeah.
And what happens when an autistic person in crisis seeks emergency help? Like, there's an account of a suicidal autistic adult who desperately needs entry to a behavioral health hospital. But she's denied access because she lacks what the facility calls kindergarten-level language skills.
Yeah, we have to look at the clinical architecture behind that denial. Behavioral health hospitals heavily rely on group therapy and talk therapy models. They're simply not built for patients with limited verbal communication.
Right.
Furthermore, communication is often the very first skill to regress during autistic burnout or a mental health crisis. So the facility rejects her because she doesn't fit their standard operational model.
So they just send a suicidal neurodivergent adult to the emergency room to wait for days. I mean, think about the physiological impact of an ER on an autistic brain.
A nightmare.
Fluorescent lights, unpredictable alarms, constant physical intrusions from staff. It triggers an immediate amygdala hijack. It escalates a mental health crisis into a massive sensory meltdown. The environment itself increases her depression.
Our medical frameworks are so rigidly constructed around neurotypical baseline behaviors that they actively punish patients for the very conditions they need help managing.
Here's where it gets really interesting. These hurdles don't just exist in emergency rooms, right? They are baked into standard therapy and diagnostic settings. The research mentions an autistic man whose therapist drops him for, quote, lack of progress.
Wow.
Yeah. The man was doing the homework, but standard strategies just weren't working for him. But why? Like, isn't it standard practice to refer a patient out if a specific therapy isn't effective?
It is, but the context here is the lack of alternative modalities and really the framing of the failure. Standard therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, rely heavily on identifying and correcting cognitive distortions.
Right. Changing how you think about things.
Exactly. But for an autistic person, their anxiety might not be a distorted thought. It might be a highly logical response to sensory overwhelm or social confusion. The standard tool fails because it is the wrong tool for that specific neurology.
That makes total sense.
But rather than recognizing a modality mismatch, the system frames it as patient noncompliance. The patient is blamed for the therapist's lack of neurodivergent affirming tools.
That is just infuriating. And it brings us to the paradox of the diagnostic process itself.
Yeah.
Like, there's a case of a married, college-educated woman who suspects she is autistic. She pursues a diagnosis, she checks all the clinical boxes, but the trained psychologist denies her the diagnosis.
And her reasoning is just,
It's wild. The reasoning is that because she has a degree and a spouse, she doesn't meet the standard of clinically significant impairment. From a purely clinical perspective, if the manual requires impairment and she is holding down a job and a marriage, hasn't she objectively avoided impairment?
if we connect this to the bigger picture, we uncover the massive flaw in how the psychiatric community actually measures impairment. It only measures external impairment.
External meaning what other people see.
Exactly how much the patient's struggles inconvenience the people around them. It completely ignores internal impairment. This woman is engaged in what we call high masking.
The emulator metaphor works perfectly here.
Yes, exactly. Imagine a computer running an operating system, let's say a Mac running a Windows emulator. It can technically run the programs, the social behaviors, the eye contact, the script of neurotypical life.
Right.
But because it's running an emulator, the fans are spinning at maximum speed, the system is overheating, and the battery drains 10 times faster than a native system.
Wow.
That autistic woman is manually calculating social cues that are just automatic for neurotypicals. The clinically significant impairment is the massive internal energy drain that leads to physical illness and burnout.
And denying her the diagnosis isn't just an invalidation of her lived experience. It has severe economic consequences. Without the diagnosis, she has no legal protection or entitlement to workplace accommodations.
None at all.
The text notes that she is eventually fired from that job. Society claims to accept autism, but the system punishes people for surviving it. We force them to mask and then deny them support because they masked too well.
It is a facade, and we really have to ask why these gaps exist. Like, why is the medical system so fundamentally under-equipped, and why is funding for infrastructure so incredibly sparse?
Yeah, where's the money?
The answer lies in how public funding is allocated, which is entirely driven by public perception and political rhetoric.
The broader socio-political environment is actively shaping these healthcare outcomes. The piece provides a very specific look at how public policy proposals create a direct chilling effect. Like, there's this adult who suspects they are autistic, right? They wait nearly a year for a testing appointment. But then they hear news reports that the government is floating the idea of creating a registry to track autistic people.
Upon hearing this, the individual is just overwhelmed with dread. The fear of being placed on a government tracking list is so severe that they abruptly call and cancel the diagnostic appointment they had waited a year for.
They just choose to walk away from life-altering healthcare and legal accommodations.
This raises an important question about cause and effect in public discourse. Political rhetoric is not just noise, It is a mechanism of access.
Right.
When public policy discussions treat a demographic as a liability to be tracked, the perceived threat of the socio-political climate becomes higher than the distress of the undiagnosed condition. The rhetoric literally blocks the clinic door.
And the cultural rhetoric is just as damaging. Public figures and media outlets frequently characterize autism as a, quote, horror show, or they claim that it destroys families.
It's awful.
Imagine the psychological toll that takes on an autistic person just scrolling through their feed, or the terror it instills in parents trying to navigate care systems.
That fear traps families in impossible situations. The text describes parents who visit their autistic son's supported living home, and they notice suspicious bruising on him.
Oh, God.
When they ask him what happened, he points at the staff and repeatedly says, hurt.
But the staff denies any wrongdoing, right? And the parents can't definitively prove abuse, so they face a literal nightmare scenario. Because if they pull him out of the facility, where does he go?
Exactly.
There are virtually no quality, well-funded alternative programs in their geographic area.
And we have to understand the mechanism of autistic routines here. For many autistic individuals, extreme routine is what regulates their nervous system.
Right, it keeps them grounded.
Pulling him out of his living situation without a viable alternative is a massive disruption that will likely lead to severe dysregulation, increased physical aggression, and total destabilization.
They are completely trapped by a lack of alternative infrastructure. They might have to leave their child in a potentially dangerous environment simply to maintain his baseline stability.
It's unthinkable.
So I have to ask you, the listener, how can an entire community feel genuinely accepted during the month of April when the ambient rhetoric around them treats their existence as a tragedy, and the systems designed to protect them are so fragile that they collapse under the slightest pressure?
The contrast is just jarring, which is exactly why the focus has to pivot from admiring the problem to actually implementing solutions. If ASEAN's mandate that acceptance is an action holds true, we have to define the mechanics of that action.
So what does this all mean? How do we move from a performative April to a year-round pursuit of actual acceptance? Well, the author lays out a blueprint of concrete steps.
It starts at the civic level. The directive is to contact local and national politicians and explicitly demand funding for the infrastructure we just dissected.
We need the funding.
We need robust funding for specialized respite care, safe and transparent housing supports, and intersectional therapies that don't force children onto 2-year waitlists.
The second action step is immediate and personal, which is to offer direct support to autistic people and their families. Remember that socioeconomic void we talked about earlier? The mother awake at 2 a.m. or the couple without a sitter. Direct support means stepping into that void. It means providing community care to catch the people falling through the cracks of systemic care.
And the third action addresses the cultural narrative. We must actively speak out against the rhetoric that frames autism as a horror show.
Yeah, push back on that language.
Because words dictate public perception dictates policy, and policy dictates funding. Changing a narrative is the first domino in building better infrastructure.
Next, we have to change who we are actually listening to. For too long, the narrative has been dominated by neurotypical people observing autism from the outside. True acceptance requires consuming books, blogs, videos, and artwork produced by autistic creators.
Right, go to the source.
Listen to autistic people, explaining the mechanics of their own lived experiences.
Finally, there is a mandate for professionals. Mental health therapists must update their continuing education to understand the intersection of autism and mental health. They have to learn the tools that work for neurodivergent brains so they just stop turning away patients in crisis.
Yeah.
And clinical psychologists must catch up on the latest research regarding high-masking autism and the female autism phenotype.
We cannot have an outdated clinical manual denying vital legal accommodations to people just because their internal suffering isn't inconveniencing the room.
My core belief has always been that knowledge is only valuable when it is applied. The ultimate metric for a society's acceptance is never going to be a branded hashtag.
Never.
The only metric that matters is the robust presence of well-funded, accessible support structures.
As we wrap up this deep dive, let's look at the ground we've covered today. We tracked the vital evolution from passive awareness to the demand for active acceptance. We dissected the mechanisms behind the everyday realities of caregiver burnout, therapeutic modality mismatches, and the devastating impact of political rhetoric on healthcare access.
A lot.
And we mapped out concrete actions to support the autistic community year-round.
It fundamentally reframes the conversation. It moves us from a posture of passive observation to an active demand for structural change.
And whether you are advocating for a loved one, working within the medical system, or just trying to be a deeply informed citizen, you now have the context. You understand the architecture of the problem, which means you have the tools to look past performative campaigns and demand real supportive action. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. It builds on our discussion of the emulator, the high-masking individuals who are denied help because they appear too functional to the outside world. Our entire medical and social support apparatus is built almost exclusively around external crisis response. If you aren't outwardly failing in a way that society recognizes, you simply do not exist in the eyes of the support system.
It is an architecture of reactive triage rather than proactive inclusion.
Right. So the question you have to ask is, how many completely invisible crises are we inadvertently punishing? Simply because someone has learned to hide their pain too well. If we go back to our earlier analogy, it is one thing to notice the broken chair at the table, but what about the person who is standing perfectly still, smiling through the exhaustion because they were never even offered a seat to begin with?
That is the reality we have to change.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the information around you, keep looking for the mechanisms behind the buzzwords, and we'll catch you next time.